The autumn wind swept across the barren stretches of Route 50 in central Utah, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. It was October 12, 2001, and the Anderson family, Robert, 42, his wife Margaret, 39, and their three children, Kyle, 14, Emma, 11, and little Joshua, 7, were driving home to Denver after a camping trip in the remote Fish Lake National Forest. They'd spent 5 days among the aspens, their golden leaves shimmering like coins in the mountain air, celebrating what Robert called unplugged family time, before the rush of the school year consumed them all. Margaret had packed sandwiches for the drive, turkey and Swiss on wheat bread, Joshua's favorite. The blue Dodge Caravan was loaded with camping gear, sleeping bags still smelling of campfire smoke, and a cooler half full of melting ice. Emma sat in the middle row, her headphones tangled around a CD player, while Kyle stared out the window at the endless expanse of desert, counting the minutes until he could get back to his friends and his basketball team. Joshua pressed his face against the glass, watching for wildlife, his stuffed bear clutched tight against his chest. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. They never made it home. When the Andersons didn't arrive in Denver that Sunday evening, Margaret's sister, Linda Hoffman, called the house repeatedly. No answer. She tried Margaret's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. By Monday morning, when Robert failed to show up for his shift as an operations manager at a logistics company, and the children were marked absent from school, Linda drove to their house in the quiet suburb of Littleton. The newspapers were piled on the front step. Mail overflowed from the box. The front door was locked, the curtains drawn. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it. Dishes in the sink, a calendar on the fridge with "camping trip" written in Margaret's looping handwriting. Linda called the police. Detective Frank Kowalski of the Denver Police Department took the missing persons report that afternoon. He was a veteran cop with 23 years on the force, a man who'd seen his share of runaways and domestic disputes, but something about this case unsettled him from the start. The Andersons weren't the type to vanish. Robert was reliable, almost rigid in his routines. Margaret volunteered at the children's school every Thursday. They had mortgage payments, dental appointments, a dog named Biscuit, staying with neighbors who were now frantic with worry. "When did you last speak with them?" Kowalski asked Linda, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Thursday night," Linda said, her voice trembling. "Margaret called from the campground. She said they were having a wonderful time. Kyle caught a fish. Emma found some kind of rare mushroom she wanted to look up. Joshua was being Joshua, asking a million questions about everything." She paused, tears welling in her eyes. "She said they'd be home Sunday by dinner. That was it. That was the last time I heard her voice." Kowalski contacted the U.S. Forest Service and the Utah Highway Patrol. The Andersons had checked out of the Fish Lake campground on Saturday morning, October 13th. According to the camp host's logbook, Robert had mentioned they were taking the scenic route home through central Utah, maybe stopping at a few overlooks. It was supposed to be a leisurely drive, no rush, just a family enjoying the last gasps of warm weather before winter settled in. Search teams were dispatched along Route 50, that lonely stretch of two-lane blacktop that locals called the loneliest road in America. Volunteers from Denver drove down to help. Linda made flyers with the family's photograph, all 5 of them grinning at the camera during last year's Christmas, Joshua missing his 2 front teeth. The flyers went up in gas stations, diners, truck stops, anywhere someone might have seen a blue Dodge Caravan with Colorado plates. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Tips came in, as they always do. A gas station attendant in Green River thought he'd seen them. A waitress in Salina remembered a family with 3 kids, but she couldn't be sure. None of the leads panned out. The van's license plate never triggered any automated readers. No credit card transactions appeared after October 12th. It was as if the Anderson family had driven off the edge of the earth. By December, the case had gone cold. Kowalski kept the file on his desk, refusing to let it be archived, but there was nowhere left to look. The desert had swallowed them whole. Robert's parents, Helen and Walter Anderson, moved into the Littleton house to keep it from falling into foreclosure. They couldn't bear to sell it, couldn't accept that their son and his family were truly gone. Helen left the children's rooms exactly as they were. Kyle's basketball posters on the wall, Emma's collection of smooth river stones on her dresser, Joshua's stuffed animals arranged on his bed. Every night, she set 5 places at the dinner table, a ritual that made Walter's heart break a little more each time. "They're coming back," Helen would say, her voice defiant against the silence. "I know they are." But years passed. 5 years, 10, 15. The media moved on to newer tragedies. The volunteers stopped calling. Even Linda, who had dedicated every spare moment to searching, to hiring private investigators with money she didn't have, began to accept the unbearable possibility that she would never know what happened to her sister and her family. Detective Kowalski retired in 2012, but he never stopped thinking about the Andersons. He kept a copy of the case file at home, along with that Christmas photo. Sometimes, late at night, he'd pull it out and stare at their faces, wondering where they'd gone, what had happened on that October day 22 years ago. The answer was buried beneath 12 feet of sand and rock, hidden in a ravine just off Route 50, waiting to be found. In the spring of 2023, a graduate student named Aaron Voss at the University of Utah was working on his thesis involving satellite imagery and geological mapping. His project focused on identifying illegal dumping sites and abandoned vehicles in Utah's vast public lands, using high-resolution satellite data combined with advanced machine learning algorithms. The technology had improved dramatically in recent years, capable of detecting anomalies beneath soil and vegetation that would be invisible to the naked eye. Aaron spent months feeding data into his system, training it to recognize the metallic signatures of vehicles, the geometric patterns that didn't occur naturally in desert landscapes. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, his computer flagged an anomaly approximately 7 miles east of the small town of Hinckley, Utah, in Millard County. The satellite scan showed what appeared to be a large metallic object buried in a wash, partially concealed by decades of sediment and flash flood debris. At first, Aaron thought it might be an old mining vehicle or farm equipment. The area was remote, accessible only by a rough dirt road that barely qualified as such. But something about the signature nagged at him. The size was consistent with a van or SUV. The depth suggested it had been there for many years. He cross-referenced the location with databases of reported vehicle thefts and accidents. Nothing came up. On a whim, he expanded his search to missing persons cases. That's when he found them, the Anderson family, missing since October 2001. Last seen leaving Fish Lake National Forest, headed east on Route 50. Aaron stared at the case file, at the photo of 5 smiling faces, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He picked up his phone and called the Millard County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Tom Bridger was skeptical at first. He'd been sheriff for 18 years and had heard his share of wild theories from amateur sleuths and psychics, claiming to know where missing people were buried. But Aaron's credentials were solid, and the satellite data was compelling. Bridger agreed to send a deputy out to investigate. Deputy Rachel Torres drove out to the site on March 29th, accompanied by Aaron and a search and rescue team. The location was exactly as desolate as the coordinates suggested, miles from the nearest house, surrounded by low hills of red rock and creosote bushes. The wash was dry now, but the evidence of past flooding was everywhere. Channels carved deep into the earth, rocks rounded smooth by rushing water. They brought ground-penetrating radar, and within an hour they'd confirmed it. There was definitely something metallic buried in the wash, approximately 12 feet below the surface. The shape and size were consistent with a minivan. Sheriff Bridger authorized an excavation. The digging took 2 days. Backhoes and shovels carefully removed layers of compacted sand and gravel. On the afternoon of March 31st, 2023, they uncovered the roof of a blue Dodge Caravan. The paint was faded, scratched by rocks and debris, but the vehicle was remarkably intact, preserved by the dry desert conditions and the weight of earth that had protected it from scavengers. Colorado license plates. The registration matched. It was the Andersons' van. Bridger called Denver immediately. Detective Kowalski, now 71 and living in quiet retirement, answered his phone and listened in stunned silence as Bridger explained what they'd found. "Are they—" Kowalski couldn't finish the sentence. "We haven't opened it yet," Bridger said gently. "We're treating it as a recovery scene. The medical examiner is on her way." By the time the van was fully excavated and carefully removed from the wash, a crowd had gathered. Law enforcement, forensic teams, news crews who'd caught wind of the discovery. The story had exploded across social media. The family that vanished 22 years ago, found at last. The van was transported to a secure facility in Fillmore, where the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chen, and her team began the painstaking process of documenting everything. The windows were intact but covered in a thick layer of sediment. The interior was filled with sand that had seeped in through small gaps over the years. When they finally opened the doors, they found camping gear, suitcases, a cooler, and they found the Anderson family. Robert was in the driver's seat, Margaret beside him. The 3 children were in the back, still buckled into their seats. After 22 years, they were finally going home. The forensic examination took weeks. Dr. Chen's report was thorough and heartbreaking. The cause of death for all 5 family members was drowning and blunt force trauma, consistent with being caught in a flash flood. The van had been swept off the road during what must have been a sudden and catastrophic wall of water. Carried nearly a quarter mile before becoming lodged in the wash and buried under tons of debris. Flash floods in the Utah desert are notoriously deadly and unpredictable. The October 2001 weather record showed that a severe thunderstorm had moved through the area on the evening of October 13th, dropping over 3 inches of rain in less than an hour. In the desert, where the ground is hard and impermeable, that kind of rainfall doesn't soak in. It runs. It gathers in every depression and channel, transforming dry washes into raging torrents in minutes. People have been killed by flash floods while standing under clear blue skies, the storm miles away, invisible beyond the hills. The Andersons had been driving through at exactly the wrong moment. They likely never saw it coming. One moment, they were on a lonely stretch of highway, perhaps admiring the sunset. Joshua asking when they'd be home, Emma listening to music, Kyle thinking about basketball practice. The next, a wall of water and debris, rocks and mud, and the furious power of nature unleashed, slamming into the van with enough force to lift it off the pavement and carry it away like a toy. There was no evidence of mechanical failure, no indication they'd tried to outrun the flood. It had simply happened too fast. The van had been swept downstream, rolled and battered until it came to rest in a depression, where subsequent floods buried it deeper and deeper, year after year, until it disappeared entirely from view. Margaret's sister, Linda, now 62 and living in Boulder, received the call she'd been waiting 22 years to get. Sheriff Bridger was gentle, but there was no easy way to deliver such news. Linda sat down on her kitchen floor and wept, a mixture of relief and renewed grief washing over her in waves. At least now she knew. At least now they could bring them home. Helen Anderson, Robert's mother, was 91 years old and living in an assisted care facility. Walter had passed away in 2019, his heart finally giving out under the weight of not knowing. When they told Helen that her son and his family had been found, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." She died 3 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, finally at rest. The funeral was held in Denver on a warm day in May. Hundreds of people attended, friends, former neighbors, Kyle's basketball teammates now in their mid-30s with families of their own, Emma's classmates who'd become teachers and nurses and parents, people who'd volunteered in the searches all those years ago. Linda gave the eulogy, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Margaret used to say that family was everything," Linda said, looking out at the crowd. "She believed in unplugged time, in being together, in making memories. That's what they were doing when this happened. They were together. And in a way, I find comfort in that. They didn't suffer alone. They were together until the very end." The 5 caskets were buried side by side in a cemetery in Littleton, under a large oak tree. The headstones were simple, each bearing a name and the dates of birth and death, and a single phrase that Linda had chosen: "Together always." Detective Kowalski attended the funeral, leaning heavily on a cane, his face lined with age and sorrow. After the service, he approached Linda and handed her something. The Christmas photo he'd kept all these years, the one with Joshua's missing teeth and their bright, hopeful smiles. "I think this belongs with you now," he said quietly. Linda took it, holding it carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for never giving up." In the months that followed, the story of the Anderson family became a cautionary tale about the dangers of flash floods in the desert, the unpredictability of nature, and the importance of heeding weather warnings even in seemingly safe conditions. The stretch of Route 50 where they'd been swept away was marked with new signs, warning of flash flood danger. The Utah Department of Transportation installed additional gauges and warning systems in the area. Aaron Voss, the graduate student whose satellite mapping had led to the discovery, completed his thesis and went on to work with law enforcement agencies across the country, using his technology to locate other missing persons and vehicles. He never forgot the Andersons, the family whose tragedy had given purpose to his work. Linda sold the house in Littleton finally, unable to bear the empty rooms any longer. She used some of the money to establish a scholarship fund in the children's names at their old school, supporting students who showed promise in science, athletics, and creative writing. One scholarship for each of the Anderson children, honoring who they'd been and who they might have become. On October 13th, 2024, the 23rd anniversary of their disappearance, and exactly 1 year after their bodies were recovered, Linda drove to Utah. She found the spot where the van had been buried, now marked with a simple memorial, 5 stones arranged in a circle, each bearing a name. Wildflowers had been planted there by locals, bright splashes of color against the red desert earth. Linda stood in the wash, listening to the wind, imagining that October day in 2001. She thought about her sister, about the phone call from the campground, Margaret's voice warm and happy, describing the trip, the children's laughter in the background. She thought about all the years of not knowing, the sleepless nights, the false hopes and dead ends. But she also thought about the answer she'd finally received, the closure that had seemed impossible for so long, the knowledge that Margaret and Robert and the children hadn't suffered for long, that they'd been together, that they were at peace now. "I love you," Linda whispered to the desert wind. "I never stopped looking, and I'll never forget." She placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the memorial, 1 flower for each member of the family. Then she stood there for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the wash, the same wash that had become their resting place for more than 2 decades. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The kind of sunset the Andersons would have pulled over to admire, would have pointed out to Joshua, would have tried to capture in photographs that never quite did it justice. As darkness fell, Linda drove back toward the highway, leaving the memorial behind. But she carried them with her, as she always had, in her memories, in her heart. In the stories she would tell about the sister she'd loved and the family that had vanished one October day and had finally, after all these impossible years, come home. The desert kept its secrets, but this one, at least, had been revealed. The Anderson family's story had ended not with answers, but with peace, and sometimes, after 22 years of questions, peace was enough. The years following the discovery brought unexpected ripples of change, small transformations that spread outward from that lonely wash in central Utah like circles on still water. The Anderson case became more than just a tragedy. It became a catalyst for how missing persons investigations were conducted across the American West. Aaron Voss's satellite mapping technology, which had been dismissed by some as experimental and unreliable, gained credibility overnight. By late 2023, his research had attracted the attention of the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, known as NAMUS. They awarded him a grant to expand his work, partnering with NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey to create a comprehensive database of potential burial sites across thousands of square miles of remote terrain where people had vanished over the decades. The program was named the Anderson Initiative. By the spring of 2024, Aaron's team had identified 17 additional anomalies that warranted investigation. 12 turned out to be abandoned vehicles with no connection to missing persons cases, old farm trucks, stolen cars dumped in the desert, a school bus that had been used as a hunting camp in the 1970s. But 3 of the sites yielded heartbreaking discoveries that brought closure to families who'd been waiting even longer than Linda Hoffman had. In June 2024, they found the remains of Thomas and Diane Fletcher, a retired couple from Phoenix who'd disappeared in 1998 while driving through Nevada. Their pickup truck had gone off a remote Forest Service road during a snowstorm, rolling into a ravine and becoming completely hidden by accumulated snow and fallen timber. 26 years later, their daughter, now 53, could finally lay them to rest. In September, the remains of a young woman named Jessica Pruitt were discovered in New Mexico. She'd been 22 when she vanished in 2004, driving from Albuquerque to visit her mother in Texas. Her car had hydroplaned during a rainstorm and gone off an embankment into an arroyo, where erosion and vegetation had concealed it. Her mother, who'd spent 2 decades believing her daughter had been the victim of foul play, wept with relief when the medical examiner confirmed it had been an accident. Each discovery brought grief, but also gratitude. The not knowing, families said over and over, was worse than any terrible truth. Linda Hoffman followed these developments closely, feeling a strange kinship with these other families. She joined a support group for relatives of the long-term missing, and after the Andersons were found, she became an advocate, speaking at conferences about the importance of never giving up, of supporting technological innovation in search and recovery efforts. In January 2025, she was invited to speak at a symposium in Salt Lake City, hosted by the National Association of Search and Rescue. The auditorium was filled with search professionals, law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, and families of the missing. Linda stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and shared her story. "For 22 years I lived in 2 worlds simultaneously," she said, her voice clear and steady. "In one world, my sister and her family were gone, and I had to accept that and move forward with my life. In the other world, they were still out there somewhere, waiting to be found, and I couldn't stop searching. It's an impossible way to live, holding both realities at once. But that's what families of the missing do every single day. She paused, collecting her thoughts. When they were finally found, people asked me if I had closure. And honestly, I'm not sure closure is the right word. What I have is an answer. I know what happened. I know where they are. I can visit them, talk to them, bring flowers on their birthdays. That's not closure, that's connection. And it made all the difference. The room was silent except for the sound of people quietly weeping. After the symposium, a woman in her late 40s approached Linda in the hallway. Her name was Brenda Yates, and her brother Marcus had disappeared in 2006 while hiking in the Grand Canyon. Despite extensive searches, he'd never been found. "I've been doing this for 19 years, Brenda said, her eyes red-rimmed, waiting, wondering. "Some days I think I can't do it anymore, but hearing you speak today, it reminded me why I keep going." Linda took Brenda's hands in hers. "He's out there somewhere," she said softly. "And someday, someone will find him. Technology is getting better every year. Don't give up hope." They exchanged contact information, and Linda added Brenda to the network of families she'd come to know, people bound together by absence and perseverance. Back in Boulder, Linda had transformed her guest bedroom into a small office dedicated to her advocacy work. The walls were covered with photographs of missing persons, maps of search areas, articles about new detection technologies. She volunteered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and consulted with search teams planning operations in remote areas, sharing what she'd learned from her own experience. One afternoon in March 2025, she received an email from Aaron Voss. His team had been scanning an area in southern Idaho where a family of 4 had vanished in 1993. The satellite imagery had flagged a potential vehicle buried in a canyon near the Snake River. They were planning an excavation for next month. Would Linda be willing to reach out to the family, to prepare them for what might be found? Linda responded immediately. Yes, of course she would. The family, the Kowalskis, no relation to the Denver detective, had been searching for 32 years. The parents were elderly now, in their 80s, their health failing. Linda called them and spoke for over an hour, sharing her own story, explaining what to expect, offering comfort and support. When the excavation confirmed it was indeed their son's vehicle, containing the remains of him, his wife, and their 2 young children, Linda flew to Idaho to attend the funeral. "You gave us hope when we'd almost run out," Mrs. Kowalski told her, gripping Linda's hand with surprising strength. "You helped us understand that finding them was possible. Thank you." As Linda looked around at the mourners, many of whom she recognized from the missing persons advocacy community, she realized something profound. The tragedy that had shattered her world in 2001 had somehow, impossibly, created ripples that had helped others. Margaret would have liked that, Linda thought. Her sister had always believed that suffering could be transformed into purpose if you were brave enough to try. Detective Kowalski, the original investigator, passed away in his sleep in April 2025 at the age of 73. Linda attended his funeral in Denver, where she learned that he'd left instructions for a portion of his estate to be donated to the Anderson Initiative. His widow, Patricia, explained that Frank had never gotten over the case. "He used to say those children haunted him," Patricia said, dabbing at her eyes. "Not in a scary way, but in a way that reminded him why he'd become a cop in the first place. When they were finally found, it was like he could rest. He was so proud of what came from that discovery." Sheriff Tom Bridger from Millard County, Utah, who'd authorized the original excavation, retired in June 2025. At his retirement party, he gave a speech about the cases that had defined his career, and he mentioned the Andersons. "Finding that family changed how I think about my job," he said. "For years I'd heard about missing persons cases and thought, well, they probably just took off, started a new life somewhere. The Andersons taught me that sometimes people aren't running away. They're just victims of terrible luck and the power of nature. It made me more compassionate, more willing to believe families when they said something was wrong. That's a lesson I'll carry forever. Deputy Rachel Torres, who'd been at the excavation site that day in March 2023, had been so affected by the case that she'd returned to school to become a forensic anthropologist. By 2025, she was completing her doctorate with a dissertation focused on improving recovery techniques in desert environments. She'd interviewed Linda extensively for her research. The Anderson case demonstrates the intersection of technology, persistence, and human compassion, Rachel wrote in her introduction. It shows us that even decades later, answers are possible, and it reminds us that behind every missing person statistic is a family that deserves the truth. The scholarship fund Linda had established in the children's names had grown substantially, funded by donations from across the country. By the fall of 2025, it had awarded over 100 scholarships to students at the Littleton schools. Some recipients had gone on to become scientists, coaches, writers, exactly the kinds of people Kyle, Emma, and Joshua might have become. One recipient, a young woman named Maria Santos, who'd received the Emma Anderson Creative Writing Scholarship in 2015, had just published her first novel, a mystery about a family's decades-long search for the truth. She dedicated it to the Anderson family and all those still waiting to be found. Linda attended the book launch in Denver, where Maria read from the dedication and spoke about how the scholarship had changed her life. "I never knew the Andersons," Maria said, "but their story gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise, and it inspired me to write about the power of love and determination. In a way, they're still making a difference in the world, even though they've been gone for almost a quarter century." On October 13, 2025, Linda returned once again to the memorial site in Utah. This time, she wasn't alone. Brenda Yates was with her, along with the Kowalskis from Idaho, and a dozen other family members of people who'd been found through the Anderson Initiative. They'd decided to hold an annual gathering, a day of remembrance for those who'd been lost and those who'd been found. They stood together in the wash where the van had been buried, sharing stories, supporting each other, placing flowers on the memorial stones. Someone had added a plaque since Linda's last visit. It read, "In memory of the Anderson family and all those lost to the desert's embrace. May they rest in peace, and may their stories inspire us to never stop searching." As the sun set over the red rocks, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Linda thought about Margaret's last phone call from the campground, her sister's voice, full of joy and life, describing their wonderful time together. She thought about how that happiness had been cut short by a random act of nature, a flash flood in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she also thought about everything that had come after. The technology developed, the families reunited with their lost loved ones, the scholarships awarded, the lives changed. Tragedy had transformed into purpose. Grief had become action. Loss had sparked innovation. "We're making a difference," Brenda whispered beside her, as if reading Linda's thoughts. "Because of them, because of what happened, we're actually making a difference." Linda nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As darkness fell and the group began to disperse, heading back to their cars and their hotels and their own ongoing journeys through grief and healing, Linda lingered a moment longer. She placed her hand on the stone bearing Margaret's name, feeling the warmth retained from the day's sun. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "I never stopped looking. And now you're helping others be found too. I think you'd be proud of that." The desert wind whispered through the wash, carrying the scent of sage and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The stars emerged one by one overhead, the same stars that had shone down on the Anderson family that last night, that October evening in 2001, when everything changed. Linda walked back to her car, carrying with her not just the memory of loss, but the knowledge of impact. The Anderson family's story hadn't ended in that wash. It had evolved, transformed, grown into something larger than tragedy. It had become hope. And in a world where so many families still waited for answers, hope was everything. As she drove away from the memorial, Linda made a silent promise to Margaret, to Robert, to Kyle and Emma and Joshua. She would continue the work. She would keep advocating for better technology, more resources, expanded search efforts. She would support other families walking the impossible path she'd walked for 22 years. The desert faded in her rearview mirror, but its lessons remained. Nature was powerful and indifferent. Life was fragile and precious. Family was everything. And sometimes, even after decades of darkness, light could break through. The Anderson family had vanished in 2001, but they were never really gone. They lived on in scholarships and innovations, in solved cases and reunited families, in the determination of people like Aaron Voss and Rachel Torres and Linda herself, people who refused to accept that the missing would remain forever lost. 24 years after that October day, the legacy of the Anderson family continued to grow, touching lives they'd never met, solving mysteries they'd never known existed, bringing peace to hearts that had been broken by absence and uncertainty. And that, Linda realized as she drove through the gathering darkness toward home, was perhaps the most powerful answer of all. Not just what had happened to them, but what had happened because of them. Not just how they'd been found, but who else had been found because of their story. The loneliest road in America was a little less lonely now, marked with memorials and warnings and hope, and 5 people who'd set out on a family camping trip 24 years ago, seeking nothing more than time together and memories to cherish, had inadvertently created a legacy that would echo for generations. Together, always, the headstones read, and in the most profound way possible, that promise had come true.